Hello, sophomores. Happy Easter. Welcome to the next installment of the Church History series. We left off with absolutism in the Great French Century, setting the table for the Enlightenment. And it's somehow during this period of the Enlightenment that we switched from the Baroque age to the modern age. So without any further ado, here we go, the Enlightenment, which is ultimately anti-Christian in its intent and its effect. You'll see it's not all bad, but as a whole, it was not a good thing, and it's much more egotistical than it can back up. Anyway, here you have an image. I'm not sure where that line is in the middle. It's a famous image of drawing of King Louis XIV visiting the Academy of the Sciences in France. So a new mindset took root in the intelligentsia during the reign of Louis XIV. The intelligentsia, I'm talking about the movers, the shakers, the opinion makers of the society, the equivalent of the people on Madison Avenue writing advertisements today, and the equivalent of the people editing the top newspapers and directing the news programs, and in the think tanks, the people in key positions. Now, this mindset was aided, if not enabled, by the breaking of Christian unity brought about by Protestantism, but it was much worse. It took it to a new level. The religion is Deism, okay? English Deism, which we'll get into, in French Rationalism, prepared the ground for the openly anti-Christian work of the philosophers of the Enlightenment. Okay, Deism is this idea of God as divine watchmaker. We'll go into that in a little bit more. French Rationalism, it doesn't have to be French, by the way, but this idea of rationalism is when you only accept what you yourself can understand with your own reason. Okay, and I put Enlightenment in quotes because in a lot of ways it's like a guy who knows a little bit, just enough to be dangerous. That's how kind of Western society is at this point. There's that image again. Okay, the Enlightenment philosophers rejected the idea of revelation. Philosophes, you can see it looks like the word philosopher. It's the French word for these Enlightenment paragons, these thinkers. They could have been in science, the arts, philosophy, or what have you. And they rejected this whole idea of revelation, of God showing us things that we would not be able to understand on our own. See different images here that are going to come back in the presentation. Now, Christianity is built upon truths of a supernatural order. The believer gets access to them not through his or her own mental efforts or experience, but by faith. That's by Jose Orlandis from A Short History of the Catholic Church. I thought that was a pretty short and insightful statement about this, right? That, that the truths revealed by faith are higher than we could get to without faith. It's that simple. They're not simplistic, though, but it's not through, the brightest human being that ever walked this earth, an Aristotle, an Aquinas, an Augustine, an Einstein, could never figure out the Trinity or come up with that God as one in three persons. It had to be revealed. This new approach rejects everything which cannot be completely grasped by human reason. That's this idea of rationalism. It gets started in the thought of this guy named René Descartes, right, in the early 1600s, who himself was a Catholic, never left the faith, and he accepted truths, but he started this trend, this very dangerous trend. He said, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. So you see, he's doubting everything, even his own existence, but then he realized since he's thinking, he doesn't need to doubt his own existence, right? He also invented the coordinate plane, that if you like graphing equations and algebra and this kind of thing, it's a lot of higher math is dependent upon some breakthroughs that he had, René Descartes. Now, later thinkers followed him, and they applied this doubt to everything, including knowledge based on revelation, which he accepted. right? So he started this trend, and it took off, and it turned out to be a very dangerous trend. Now, rationalism, thus unleashed, quickly becomes religious skepticism, hedonism, and eventually nihilism. This is as old as the scriptures. Okay, so rationalism means you only accept, again, what you can understand, right? It becomes kind of skepticism. You reject everything else. You're skeptical. You know, it's you're from Missouri, the show me state. You doubt things, right? And if you doubt things and you start to live this way, it leads to a hedonistic approach, which means just pleasure for its own sake. You doubt that there's a life after, you're going to be judged. You doubt there's ultimate meaning to things, so you become very pleasure-oriented. And then nihilism means there's no meaning in anything. And you could see this idea in the scriptures. This is what the Jews were surrounded by in the Old Testament. You can also see in Western philosophy, with the ancient Greeks, that this is what early philosophy was contending with. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, those types. Now, some philosophers use poor interpretations of Scripture against the Scripture themselves, the old straw man argument, right? Remember, the straw man is if I'm going to use a straw man fallacy on you, you make a point, and then I twist your point so it's kind of absurd, and I argue against the version that I said, right? It's a straw man. The way they might have done this was to say, listen, you say that the Scriptures say that the sun rises and sets around the earth, but we know that actually the earth revolves around the sun, therefore the Scriptures are false. Well, from the way it looks like a sunrise or sunset, and when Scripture talks about the sun rising, it's talking about a new day. To think of it as a scientific statement that the sun revolves around the earth would be a misinterpretation of Scripture, right? And to therefore say that Scripture is wrong because of that, it's clearly an obvious straw man. Another one would be like the age of the earth, if you date back from Adam to the Christ or what have you, and they say, well, the earth's got to be much older than that, and most scientists think that. Not all of them do, though. It's interesting. You can really get into it. Just two straw man type arguments. Now, again, so they reject these false interpretations, so therefore they say all the Scriptures are false. And then basically the only part of the Scriptures they accept, are anything that doesn't refer to anything miraculous or supernatural, right? And they therefore put the Scriptures on the level of superstition and legend. Thomas Jefferson would be an American philosopher, so would Benjamin Franklin. And Jefferson had his own version of the Bible where he cut out anything miraculous, right? That's a very Enlightenment kind of thing to do. Jefferson's a bright and talented guy in a lot of ways, but I would say a very piss-poor theologian. There's that image again. Their religion is deism, right? And this image, of course, is of a watchmaker. Deism, right? So Deo is Latin for God. So a deist accepts that there's a God. But the God of deism was that of the watchmaker, who remains in the background after making the watch. So he just creates things by certain laws and then lets it go. It rejects any kind of revelation or the sense of God acting within creation, right, which God has done repeatedly throughout time, throughout salvation history, culminating with God becoming man himself in the incarnation, starting his church. Right, so deism rejects all that. It says there's a God, but that he wouldn't get involved. Doesn't make sense to pray to such a God. Right, so you can see this is a direction moving away from the true faith. Deism began in England, but quickly spread to France and Germany. Freemasonry. Deists were frequently Freemasons. You see, this is a logo of Freemasonry. You have the compass on top. You have the corner, the straight edge on the bottom. And then you have the eye, the Gnostic eye, the secret knowledge. Freemasonry is a secret society begun in the early 1700s and was overtly anti-Christian. Right? The Masons exerted tremendous influence socially and politically in Europe and in the United States. They occupied the key positions in the think tanks of the time, in the news organs of the time, and the universities, the opinion makers, key spots. This is a quote right out of Orlandus. "The year 1715, the year that Louis XIV died, saw the opening of the floodgates of irreligion. In the decades that followed, the philosophes literally imposed themselves on the cultural life of France and elsewhere. They were in fact a kind of sect, in which Voltaire performed the role of high priest." Sect is kind of a religious denomination. Remember, at this point, France is still the preeminent country in the world. England hasn't supplanted France in world history, and won't really until the French and Indian War is over in 1763. So France being the cultural leader, England is on the rise, but not there yet. The fact that these philosophes managed to kind of dominate the culture of France really is a bad sign for the way history is going. This is Voltaire. Voltaire wasn't much of an original thinker. He derived his main ideas from others, but was particularly good at repackaging them and mocking his opponents, giving you good sound bites, He was obsessed with eliminating Christianity. Jesus Christ, he went so far to write, needed 12 apostles to spread the gospel. I am going to show that one is enough to destroy it. Though the Enlightenment was not all bad, it was predominantly anti-Christian. Okay. Listen, how is it not all bad? It had valid insights into aspects of society, the natural world, the natural law. If you think God is a divine watchmaker, and you go into the watch and you see how the gears work, you're going to figure out a lot about how those gears work. And usually that's how they work. So, you're talking about things like Isaac Newton's laws for the natural world, the gravity, the laws of physics, right? The societies, this idea of divided governments, looking at, like our Constitution is a good Enlightenment kind of document in that sense, in the good sense. But the Enlightenment paradigm, the way of seeing the world, deliberately excluded the Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, of history and of the Gospels. And the effects of the Enlightenment were primarily to push society further away from identifying itself as Christian, or acting with the notions of Christian civilization. And so in the previous century, it was kings regarding themselves as God's instrument on earth, which is bad enough, because then only God can judge them, only God can limit them. But as society goes away from even that kind of sense at all, of anyone judging you, it's going to get pretty dangerous. You couldn't have had a total war like in World War I or World War II in the 18th century with the vestiges of Christian civilization as it was. Not just the technology, but the attitudes. And I'll give you some examples to specify how the Enlightenment is hostile to Christianity. It rejects the very idea of dogmatic truth. Okay, dogma, a teaching, is regarded a priori as an expression of intolerance and fanaticism. So if you say there is one God, that's a dogma. And just by merely holding that, you're accused of something of being intolerant or fanatic, right? It basically rejects it, just like it can't prove it. It's not valid on its face, right? That's the attitude. It's the attitude of our age as well. They basically want religious people, or people who have a religion, to remain in private. It caricatured Christianity as being opposed to the experimental sciences or demands of reason. Forget the fact that Mendel, the father of genetics, was a monk, or Copernicus, who figured out the solar system, was a priest, those kind of things, ridiculous, of course. Orthodoxy for the Enlightenment is something to ridicule. It was an expression of the intellectual limitations of retarded minds and enemies of progress. The enlightened, the so-called brave spirits, prided themselves on their free thinking, which seemed to be anything other than Christianity. They call themselves free thinkers. Enlightenment toleration. Toleration is putting up with a lesser evil for the sake of a greater good. It's a traditional American virtue, right? But it had different manifestations in America and Europe. In America, had more respect for religion in general, so you wouldn't impose your religion on someone else. But there was a lot of prejudice against anyone who wasn't Protestant Christian. In Europe, though, the tendency was towards relativism, which says there's no absolute truth, there's no absolute religion at all, and therefore there's not much respect for religion in general. And that's all she wrote for now. The reasonable Christianity that the Enlightenment came without, it's kind of neutered. Rather than the man God, This makes Christ simply man, and Christianity without the miracles or dogmas. Something similar to later liberal